But first tonight, the Australian Human Rights Commission has weighed into the debate about Labor's new misinformation laws, the laws that will fine social media companies millions if they don't take down content deemed to be misinformation or even just harmful. The nation's top human rights body says there are inherent dangers in any body, be it a government task force or a social media platform, becoming the sole arbiter of truth. This in the Australian today. The Human Rights Commission said in a submission, there's a real risk that efforts to combat online misinformation and disinformation by foreign actors could be used to legitimise attempts to restrict public debate, censor unpopular opinions, and enforce ideological conformity in Australia. They said all efforts to combat misinformation need to be accompanied by transparency and scrutiny safeguards to ensure any limitations imposed upon freedom of expression are no greater than absolutely necessary and strictly justified. Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, has also said Labor's new laws would have a chilling effect on free speech. Meta said the laws could be abused if they were to be passed by Parliament.
We can see some potential for that for that power to be abused, or for it to be used in a way that inadvertently chills free and legitimate political expression online.
Twitter's head of global affairs, Nick Pickles, also highlighted concerns that the pendulum is now swinging towards greater censorship around the world. Again, he says these proposed laws will impact on free speech.
I think it's incredibly important that when these kind of regulations are being considered, laws are drafted as narrowly and as precisely as possible with robust transparency and due process, because without those, you will see a significant deterioration in free expression online.
And you won't be shocked to hear that TikTok plans to support the laws. What a surprise from the company owned and headquartered in China, the kingdom of authoritarian censorship. Senior coalition figures have slammed Labor's proposed new laws, so have high-profile commentators and journalists.
It's incredible overreach by a first-term government who are simultaneously ramping up support for the war in Ukraine while seeking to implement Soviet-style misinformation and disinformation communication legislation.
Senior lawyers have also expressed grave concerns. The former New South Wales Supreme Court Judge Anthony Whealy told The Australian this would be damaging to democracy. And Victorian barrister Peter Clark said it was, and I quote, a disgraceful piece of proposed legislation. And he was particularly concerned about the clause that captured the causing of harm as disinformation. And barrister and university law lecturer Sophie York said she was concerned that ACMA, the media watchdog, could become a PR body for the government. She said allowing any unelected body to decide what is misinformation would require them to have a wisdom which is just not possible. Journalists and commentators are also deeply worried about how this would curb free speech and reporting.
The Albanese government's planned law against so-called misinformation on the internet. It's a law that's an extraordinary attack on your free speech.
The Libs starting to say, you know what? The concept of misinformation and people getting further powers to be able to police it is always a dark place to go.
If there's anyone I wouldn't trust to decide what is fact and what is fiction, it's governments. But allowing one group of people the right to decide what is true and what isn't, and to demand that companies enforce it on pain of multi-million-dollar penalties is downright dangerous.
But this takes us to another point that no one has properly articulated yet, and it's very important. How will a Canberra bureaucrat or a social media company or the media watchdog know about cutting-edge information that's not in the public domain already? This is the whole point of investigative journalism. By its very definition, it's unearthing, it's investigating, it's uncovering new information that is not yet known. It cannot be fact-checked by middle-ranking bureaucrats on Google working for a government body, often with a computer says no mentality. It's this mentality that saw the possibility that COVID-19 inadvertently leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology labelled misinformation. Facebook censored any content that suggested COVID might have been lab-created, when in fact it might have been created through gain-of-function research. As you know, the ABC claimed any suggestion of a lab leak at all was misinformation, and they've never corrected the record.
But there have been concerns about how secure the Wuhan labs are, which has created fertile ground for allegations and even conspiracy theories.
So how likely is it that the virus escaped from that Chinese lab? Well, in short, it's not. So, why did the lab escape theory still dominate the story, especially when virus experts had dismissed it 3 days earlier in the Sydney Morning Herald?
COVID-19 did not come from lab.
The evidence is overwhelming that the virus that causes COVID-19 jumped from animals to humans, rather than escaping from a laboratory, virus experts say.
Sharri must have missed that bulletin.
This is one of the clearest examples of a topic that was censored and never should have been. And it's a point Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson made on the ABC today, on the very platform guilty of labelling this misinformation.
Can you give an example of misinformation?
Probably the best example that the platforms now admit they probably got wrong was after the outbreak of the pandemic, there were some people who said this might be an accidental lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And Facebook and others labelled that misinformation and they banned it or restricted it on their platforms. Now, fast forward a couple of years, we still don't know the origins of the pandemic. It could be natural in origin, it could have been a lab leak. But the Biden administration commissioned its intelligence community to do a review into this, and about half the intelligence community believes it is a lab leak, and about half of it believes it's natural in origin.
Right.
Something that was regarded as misinformation only a couple of years ago is now a mainstream, respected alternative theory for the source of the pandemic. It never should have been censored, and if the platforms are doing that already without the threat of fines and enforcement from ACMA, imagine what they're going to do in the future.
Imagine what they're going to do in the future. Exactly right. Investigative journalism can't be run through a computer program by fact-checkers. It involves whistleblowers, trusted sources handing over confidential information in person or via encrypted apps. It can involve translation of foreign documents, classified intelligence. It can take months and months, years and years. It can be an uphill battle, a fight to expose the truth, and often coming up against governments trying to deny or hide information, or even labelling it misinformation. As Barrister Sophie York said, and I mentioned this a moment ago, allowing any unelected body to decide what is misinformation would require them to have a wisdom which is just not possible. It's why all of us should be deeply worried about the Labor government's proposed legislation. We've seen it also with Hunter Biden's laptop. We've seen it with vaccine injuries, where even now content is still being removed or muted from social media. And we've seen in the past few weeks numerous Labor ministers accuse no campaigners of spreading misinformation. So who sets the limit about what could be removed? Would unfashionable ideas be labelled misinformation and be censored? And what about climate change deniers? Would they be allowed to express their scepticism online? And what about when there's pressure from a government minister angry about a political scare campaign, or content that a politician decides is wrong and misinformation that could be highly damaging to their own career? No government body, no social media company should have this power. There should be no Ministry of Truth in Australia. It's a dangerous concept and a slippery slope on the path to authoritarian censorship.
Every bit of disinformation and misinformation and scare campaigns
Misinformation.
Misinformation.
Misinformation. The misinformation which is there.
Some misinformation.
Spread misinformation.
Distractions and misinformation.
Misinformation.
All of the misinformation.